The smell reached them first. Neighbors at the Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had complained about it for months. A dense, sickening odor that crept under doors and settled into the walls of the building. Tenant after tenant mentioned it. Some knocked on apartment 213 to ask about it. The man who lived there, quiet, polite, soft-spoken, always had an explanation. A broken freezer, spoiled meat. He was sorry about it. He would take care of it. They believed him. On the night of July 22, 1991, 2 Milwaukee police officers spotted a slender black man running down the street with a handcuff dangling from one wrist. His name was Tracy Edwards. He was 32 years old. He was shaking. He told the officers that a man had held him captive, pressed a knife to his chest, and told him he was going to eat his heart. The officers were skeptical. Edwards seemed agitated, possibly drunk, but they followed him back to the apartment building anyway, back to apartment 213, back to the man with the explanation for everything. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. He opened the door calmly. He smiled. He told the officers it was a misunderstanding, a domestic disagreement. He offered to get the key for the handcuffs. One of the officers moved to the bedroom to look around and stopped. On the bedside table, a stack of Polaroid photographs. The images showed human bodies, men, in various stages of dismemberment, posed, photographed with the same clinical detachment one might use to document a specimen. The officer turned to Dahmer. Dahmer's calm finally broke. What they found inside apartment 213 over the next several hours became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American law enforcement history. A human head in the refrigerator. 3 more heads in the freezer. 2 skulls on top of a computer. A 57-gallon drum in the corner of the bedroom containing the dissolving remains of 3 human torsos. A box holding 2 human hearts. Preserved hands, preserved genitalia. A complete human skeleton stored in the closet. 84 Polaroid photographs documenting every stage of every murder. 11 victims had died inside that apartment. 6 more had been killed in other locations across more than a decade. 17 men. 17 boys, and the city of Milwaukee had no idea. What makes the Dahmer case one of the most studied and most disturbing in the history of criminal psychology is not only the nature of the crimes, though those crimes rank among the most extreme ever documented, but the extraordinary number of moments in which he could have been stopped, should have been stopped, and wasn't. Not because he was brilliant, not because he was untraceable, because he was white, because he was calm, because he knew how to talk to people, because the systems designed to catch killers like him failed repeatedly at every level. And most of those failures fell along racial lines that the city of Milwaukee has never fully reckoned with. This is not a story about a monster who existed outside of society. This is a story about a monster who existed inside it, protected, ignored, and enabled by the very structures that were supposed to protect his victims. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. On the surface, the family appeared ordinary. Lionel was a chemist, disciplined, methodical, detail-oriented. Joyce was a homemaker who, by most accounts, had a warm and energetic personality in her earlier years. They lived in a modest home in Bath Township, Ohio, where Jeffrey spent most of his childhood. He had a younger brother, David, born 6 years after him, but the surface concealed fault lines that ran deep. Joyce Dahmer, suffered from significant mental health issues throughout Jeffrey's childhood: anxiety, depression, and an escalating dependence on prescription medication. She was frequently bedridden. She quarreled with Lionel constantly. Loud, sustained arguments that filled the house. Jeffrey grew up in an environment of chronic emotional instability, where the adults around him were too consumed by their own crises to register what was happening to him. Lionel Dahmer, for his part, was often absent. Graduate school, laboratory work, professional obligations. He was physically present in the house, but emotionally unavailable in the ways that matter most to a child. Jeffrey was left again and again to manage his inner world alone. What was that inner world like? By the time Jeffrey was 4 years old, he had undergone surgery for a double hernia. It was a standard procedure, but something about it frightened him at a level that he was never able to articulate clearly. A fear that his body had been damaged, altered, made incomplete. His father, Lionel, later reflected that this surgery may have marked the beginning of a shift in his son's personality. The curious, energetic child who had existed before the operation became quieter afterward, more withdrawn, more internal. At age 4, Lionel made another observation about his son that he would later revisit with profound unease. While clearing animal bones from beneath the family home, a routine task, he noticed Jeffrey's intense, almost transfixed reaction to the sound the bones made as they were handled. The boy was fascinated, not frightened, fascinated. No one intervened. No one thought to. As Jeffrey moved into middle childhood, his behavior began to take on patterns that any trained clinician today would flag as requiring immediate attention. He began collecting roadkill, small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, birds, found dead along the roads near his home. He would take them to the woods behind the house. He dissected them. He studied them. He kept their skulls and bones in containers, sometimes bleached them with chemicals so they would last longer. His father, who had a background in chemistry, actually showed him how to use the chemicals more effectively. It was, Lionel apparently believed, a sign of scientific curiosity, a boy interested in how things worked. What it was, in retrospect, was a boy learning to separate the biological from the personal, to handle death with his hands and feel nothing, to treat a body as an object of study rather than a thing that had once lived and mattered. Jeffrey Dahmer was learning very early a skill that would define the next 30 years of his life. By the time he reached high school, the warning signs had multiplied. He drank, not casually, compulsively. He brought alcohol to school in a paper bag. Teachers noticed. Classmates noticed. He was known as the school drunk, a figure of mockery and mild concern, someone to be tolerated rather than helped. His grades were poor. His social connections were essentially non-existent. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, no anchoring attachments of any kind. He was also, by his own later account, becoming increasingly consumed by violent sexual fantasies involving men, involving domination, involving bodies that could not leave. He did not act on them. Not yet. But they were there, vivid, persistent, growing more elaborate with each year. In 1977, when Jeffrey was 17, his parents' marriage finally collapsed. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Mutual accusations, custody battles, legal filings. Both parents were consumed by the dissolution of their marriage. And in the summer of 1978, when the divorce was finalized and Joyce Dahmer took Jeffrey's younger brother David and moved to Wisconsin, she left 17-year-old Jeffrey alone in the family home in Ohio. Alone. For weeks, with no money, no food, and no supervision. Lionel Dahmer, who had briefly moved in with his mother, apparently assumed someone was looking after his son. No one was. Jeffrey, who had just graduated from high school, was living in an empty house with no income, no structure, and no human contact. 3 weeks after his graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim's name was Stephen Hicks. He was 18 years old. He had blonde hair and was hitchhiking to a concert when Dahmer spotted him and offered him a ride. Hicks accepted. Dahmer took him back to the empty house in Bath Township. They drank beer together. They talked. By Dahmer's own later account, he found Hicks attractive and didn't want him to leave. When Hicks stood up to go, Dahmer struck him from behind with a barbell. He strangled him. He killed him. Then he dissected the body. He buried the remains in the woods behind the house. Later, when he became anxious about discovery, he dug them up, dissolved the flesh with chemicals, and pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering the fragments through the woods. Dahmer was 18 years old. He had just committed his first murder. And then he waited, not out of remorse, not out of fear. He waited because, as he later described it, the circumstances that had allowed the murder to happen, the empty house, the isolation, the lack of oversight, were gone. His father came back. Life resumed a kind of surface normality. Dahmer enrolled briefly at Ohio State University, dropped out within weeks, and in December 1978, at his father's urging, joined the United States Army. He would not kill again for 9 years. Those 9 years are critical to understanding not just Dahmer's psychology, but the systemic failures that allowed him to continue operating for so long. He was not dormant during this period. He was not healing. He was containing, managing, suppressing an interior life of fantasies and compulsions that never stopped, that if anything grew more elaborate, more extreme, more specific with each passing year. He was stationed in Germany as a military policeman. He drank heavily, so heavily that by 1981 he was discharged from the army for alcohol abuse. He returned to the United States, drifted to Florida for a period, then eventually ended up in Milwaukee, living with his paternal grandmother in the suburb of West Allis. In 1982, he was arrested for exposing himself in public. In 1986, he was arrested again, this time for masturbating in front of 2 boys near a river. He was convicted of second-degree sexual assault, sentenced to 1 year in jail, and released after serving only 10 months. His father wrote a letter to the court prior to sentencing requesting mandatory psychological treatment. The court granted Dahmer early release without it. At this point, Dahmer had a criminal record. He had a documented pattern of predatory behavior toward young males. He was a known alcohol abuser with demonstrably poor impulse control. He was placed on probation and required to register as a sex offender. A supervision officer was assigned to monitor him. None of it worked, because Dahmer was, in the ways that matter most to surface-level systems, presentable. He held a job. He worked as a mixer at the Ambrosia chocolate factory. He had an apartment. He showed up for his probation check-ins. He said the right things. He wore the right expressions. He had mastered, through years of practice, the performance of normalcy, And beneath that performance, the compulsions that had first surfaced in the woods of Bath Township with the bones of small animals were accelerating towards something that no amount of probation check-ins was going to contain. In November 1987, 9 years after Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. The victim was Stephen Tuomi, 24 years old. Dahmer later claimed he had no memory of killing him, that he woke up in a hotel room to find Tuomi dead and could only conclude that he himself had done it. Whether this account is credible remains a matter of debate among forensic psychologists. What is not debated is what Dahmer did next. He went out, bought a large suitcase, put Tuomi's body inside it, took it by taxi back to his grandmother's house, and spent the following weeks dismembering the remains in the basement. He kept the head for 2 weeks before disposing of it. He was living in his grandmother's house. She was home. She had no idea. 3 months later, he killed again. The escalation that followed Stephen Tuomi's death is one of the most documented examples in criminal psychology of what researchers call the cooling-off compression, the progressive shortening of the interval between murders as a serial killer's compulsions overwhelm his capacity for restraint. In 1988, Dahmer killed twice. In 1989, once. In 1990, 4 times. In the first 7 months of 1991, 8 men died. The acceleration was not random. It reflected a psychology that was losing its grip on the performance of normalcy. The fantasy was no longer sufficient. The ritual, luring, drugging, killing, dismembering, preserving, had become not just a compulsion but a system. A practiced, methodical system that Dahmer refined with each iteration. He had a type. His victims were overwhelmingly young men of color, black, Asian, Latino. Many met at gay bars, at shopping malls, at bus stops. He offered them money. He offered them alcohol. He offered them the opportunity to pose for photographs, nude photographs, for which he would pay. Most declined, some accepted. Those who accepted followed him home. Once inside apartment 213, the sequence was always the same. Dahmer would offer them a drink. The drink contained crushed sleeping tablets. Dahmer had experimented extensively with different sedatives and doses to find what worked most reliably. When the victim lost consciousness, Dahmer would strangle him. Then the ritual began. He photographed every stage, every victim, before death, during, after. He kept the photographs in a bedside drawer, 84 images that constituted, in his own words, a way to relive the experience. To possess it permanently, he kept more than photographs. He kept skulls, painted grey to look like plastic models. He kept hands. He kept penises preserved in formaldehyde. He consumed flesh, human flesh, from multiple victims, describing the act in his later confessions with a clinical detachment that forensic psychiatrists found both illuminating and profoundly disturbing. He wanted, he said, for his victims to become part of him, permanent, irrevocable, incapable of leaving. The psychology here is unusually well documented because Dahmer was ultimately extraordinarily cooperative with investigators and clinicians after his arrest. He gave extended interviews. He explained himself with a degree of self-awareness that was unusual for offenders of his profile. What emerges from those accounts is a portrait of a man consumed by a terror of abandonment so absolute that it had curdled over decades of isolation and fantasy into something unrecognizable. He did not want to hurt people, he said. He wanted to keep them. That statement should not be read as mitigation. It should be read as diagnosis, a window into a psychology warped beyond recovery by a combination of developmental trauma, untreated paraphilic disorders, and a system that failed to intervene at every point where intervention was possible. The most damning of those failures was yet to come. On May 27, 1991, two young women named Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress were walking near the corner of 25th and State Street in Milwaukee when they saw something that stopped them. A boy, naked, stumbling, blood running down the back of his head, dripping onto the pavement. He was barely coherent, mumbling, unable to stand straight, unable to respond to questions with anything recognizable as language. He appeared to be no more than 11 or 12 years old. They called 911. When the officers arrived, John Balchazak, Joseph Gabrish, and Richard Porubkin, a second man, had also appeared on the scene. Calm, polite, white. He explained that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend, John Mung. They had been drinking, they had argued. The boy was simply intoxicated. The boy's name was Conarak Synthasomphone. He was 14 years old. He was Laotian. He had a hole drilled into his skull. Jeffrey Dahmer had injected muriatic acid directly into his brain in an attempt to create what he described with horrifying specificity as a compliant, permanent companion. A living body incapable of resistance or departure. Conarak had regained partial consciousness while Dahmer was out of the apartment buying beer. He had somehow made it to the street. The paramedics on scene believed the boy needed medical attention. The officers disagreed. They sent the ambulance away. Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, both black women, told the officers that the boy was a child, that something was clearly wrong, that this was not a domestic dispute between two adults. They were ignored. One officer turned his back to them and spoke exclusively to Dahmer. The officers walked Conarak Synthasomphone back into apartment 213, back to Jeffrey Dahmer. They stood in the living room for a few minutes. They left. As they departed, one officer radioed in a joking summary of the call, "Intoxicated Asian, naked male," followed by laughter about the boy being returned to his sober boyfriend. Dahmer killed Conarak within minutes of the officers leaving. There was a body in the bedroom while the officers stood in the living room. There were photographs of previous victims scattered nearby. Dahmer was, at that moment, on probation for the sexual molestation of Conarak's older brother, the same family, a fact that a basic records check would have revealed immediately. The officers ran no check. 4 more men would die before Dahmer was finally arrested. The Conarak Synthasomphone incident is the most documented and most devastating of the systemic failures surrounding Dahmer's killing years. But it was not the only one. It was the worst point in a pattern of institutional blindness that stretched back years, a pattern shaped in large part by who Dahmer's victims were and what the Milwaukee Police Department in 1991 was willing to see. Dahmer's victims were almost entirely men of color. Most were poor. Many were gay or were perceived as gay. They moved through parts of the city and through social spaces that mainstream Milwaukee, white, middle-class, suburban Milwaukee, did not look at closely. When they disappeared, the investigations were slow, the resources were limited, and the urgency was absent. Glenda Cleveland, who lived in the building next to Dahmer's and who had been one of the neighbors most persistent in raising concerns, had contacted the police multiple times in the months before Dahmer's arrest. She reported the smell. She reported seeing Dahmer escorting what appeared to be a semi-conscious young man into the building. She was told repeatedly that there was nothing the police could do, that Dahmer had explained the smell as spoiled meat, that the young man was an adult. The night Konarak was returned to Dahmer, Cleveland called the police station directly to follow up. She was told that everything was fine, that the young man was an adult. She pushed back. She asked 7 times in the documented transcript of that call for confirmation that the boy was truly an adult and not a child. 7 times. She was dismissed every time. She later said he had 100% chance to be alive if they'd done something that night. To understand why Dahmer was able to operate for as long as he did, why 17 people died before anyone looked closely at apartment 213, it is necessary to understand something about the geography of his crimes and the psychology of his method. Dahmer did not operate in darkness. He operated in plain sight, in a residential apartment building in a mid-sized American city for years. His neighbors heard sounds. They smelled the smell. They saw things that didn't add up, and they reported those things. The problem was not that Dahmer was invisible. The problem was that the people raising the alarm were not being heard. But there is another dimension to this story that is equally important, the dimension of Dahmer himself. Because the question of how he sustained his crimes for so long is not only a question about institutional failure, it is also a question about psychology, about how a human being becomes what Jeffrey Dahmer became. The forensic psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest are among the most comprehensive ever produced for a serial offender. Multiple clinicians assessed him over months. What they found was a profile that defied simple categorization. Dahmer was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and multiple paraphilic disorders, necrophilia, cannibalism, and what clinicians described as a form of extreme possession fantasy. He was not, by legal definition, insane. He understood what he was doing. He understood that it was wrong. He continued anyway. The distinction matters because it speaks to something that the public consistently struggles to accept about cases like this, that the most extreme human cruelty is rarely the product of a mind that cannot distinguish right from wrong. It is more often the product of a mind that has learned to place its own compulsions above that distinction. A mind that has, through years of unchecked internal escalation, arrived at a place where the fantasy is more real than the moral framework meant to contain it. Dahmer knew his victims were human beings. He was not delusional about that. He knew they had families. He knew they suffered. He described in clinical detail the moments immediately following each killing, the relief, the quieting of the compulsion, followed within hours by its return, stronger, more insistent, narrower in what it would accept. The cannibalism, which became public knowledge at his arrest, and which the media covered with a kind of horrified fascination that often obscured its psychological meaning, was not random. It was the logical endpoint of the possession fantasy. If the body was inside him, it could never leave. It was the most extreme possible expression of an attachment disorder, so severe and so distorted that it had abandoned every human framework for connection. Dahmer ate parts of the bicep of at least one victim. He prepared flesh in his apartment kitchen. He described the taste as similar to beef. He described the act as bringing him a sense of closeness, of permanence, that nothing else had ever provided. He had been searching for that permanence his entire life. The 17 victims of Jeffrey Dahmer deserve to be known as individuals, not as statistics, not as a collective symbol, as people with families, with histories, with futures that were taken from them. Stephen Hicks, 18, was hitchhiking to a concert the afternoon Dahmer found him. He loved music. His family spent years searching for him before Dahmer's confession finally gave them answers and remains to bury. Stephen Tuomi, 24, was a quiet young man from Michigan. His family never learned the full details of his death while his mother was still alive. Jamie Dox Tater, 14, was a young Native American boy who had run away from home. He was reported missing. His case received minimal investigative attention. Richard Guerrero, 25, was the son of Mexican immigrants. His family hired a private investigator when the police investigation stalled. His father spent years posting flyers around Milwaukee with his son's photograph. Anthony Sears, 26, was by multiple accounts a charismatic and well-liked young man who had just landed a new job the week before he disappeared. Raymond Smith, 33, known as Ricky, was a father. Edward Smith, 28, had a sister who was convinced from early on that something had happened to him, who pushed investigators repeatedly, and who was told repeatedly that adults were free to disappear if they chose to. Ernest Miller, 22, was a dance student. He disappeared after calling his aunt to let her know where he was going that evening. She was the last person he spoke to. David Thomas, 23, had a daughter. She grew up without a father, without knowing for years what had happened to him. Curtis Straughter, 18, was reported missing by his grandmother, who raised him. The investigation went nowhere. Errol Lindsay, 19, had a daughter who was born 6 months after his murder. He never met her. Tony Hughes, 31, was deaf and mute. He communicated with Dahmer through written notes on the night he died. His mother spent years refusing to accept that he was gone. Conorak Synthesomphone, 14. His family had fled Laos. His brother had already been violated by the same man. The police had had him in their hands and gave him back. Matt Turner, 20, had traveled from Chicago to Milwaukee. He was killed within days of arriving. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, was described by friends as kind, gentle, and funny. He had specifically told a friend where he was going the night he left with Dahmer. That friend's attempts to report his disappearance were not taken seriously. Oliver Lacey, 23, had a son. He was engaged to be married. Joseph Braidhoft, 25, was married. He had 3 children. He was in Milwaukee looking for work so he could support his family. 17 people. The median age of Dahmer's victims was 23 years old. 14 of his 17 victims were men of color. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 33. Their disappearances were reported in many cases to a police department that did not look for them with the resources and urgency that their families deserved. This is not ancillary to the Dahmer story. It is central to it. By the summer of 1991, Dahmer was killing at a rate of roughly 1 person per week. The acceleration was visible in the forensic record, not just in the frequency of the murders, but in their increasing disorganization. The apartment was becoming harder to manage. The drum of acid in the corner of the bedroom was overflowing. The refrigerator was full. The smell that had been drifting through the Oxford apartments for months was intensifying. Dahmer was, by every forensic indicator, approaching psychological collapse. Not into remorse, not into surrender, but into a state where his capacity to maintain the performance of normalcy was eroding under the weight of what he was sustaining. He was still going to work. He was still attending probation check-ins. He was still on the surface, the quiet, unremarkable tenant in apartment 213. But the system underneath that surface was failing. The drum was too full. The apartment was too small. The compulsion was too strong. On July 22nd, 1991, he made a mistake. He approached Tracy Edwards at a shopping mall. Edwards was 32, larger than most of Dahmer's previous victims, and physically stronger. Dahmer's usual method, the drugged drink, the incapacitation before the victim could resist, did not work as planned. Edwards held off the sedative effects longer than expected. He talked to Dahmer. He kept him engaged. He watched Dahmer carefully, and when Dahmer became distracted, sitting on the couch, rocking back and forth, chanting to himself while watching The Exorcist, Edwards struck him in the face and ran. He made it to the street with a handcuff still on his wrist. 2 patrol officers spotted him, and the house of cards that had stood for 13 years came down. The search of apartment 213 took hours. Detective Dennis Murphy, one of the first investigators on scene, later described it as the most disturbing crime scene he had encountered in his career, not because of the volume of evidence, though the volume was staggering, because of the organization of it, because of the care. The skulls on top of the computer had been painted grey. Dahmer had done this so they would look at a glance like plastic models, the kind a medical student might keep on a desk. The Polaroids in the bedside drawer were arranged. The acid drum had a lid. The freezer was closed. Everything was contained, managed, maintained within the ordinary footprint of a 1-bedroom apartment in a city of 500,000 people. Investigators found a total of 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, 2 complete skeletons, preserved genitalia, preserved hands, 3 decomposing torsos in the drum, photographs, 84 of them, documenting every victim at every stage. A kettle Dahmer had used to boil flesh from bone, formaldehyde, muriatic acid, chloroform, and a knife, the knife he had held against Tracy Edwards' chest while telling him he was going to eat his heart. Dahmer was arrested and taken to the Milwaukee Police Department's Criminal Investigation Bureau. He was calm. He asked for a cigarette. He was given one. Then he began to talk. What followed was one of the most extensive voluntary confessions in the history of American serial murder. Over the course of weeks, Dahmer sat with investigators and detailed every murder he had committed. The circumstances, the methods, the specific details of what he had done with each victim's remains. He was cooperative to a degree that initially unnerved the detectives working with him. He did not deflect. He did not minimize. He answered every question. He offered details that had not been asked for. Forensic psychiatrists who later reviewed the transcripts noted that Dahmer's confessions had the quality of relief, as though the weight of sustaining the performance of normalcy for 13 years, of containing something so vast and so dark within the boundaries of an ordinary life, had finally become too heavy to carry, and its collapse felt, on some level, like release. He confirmed the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978, the case that had remained officially unsolved for 13 years. He described the hotel room where Stephen Tuomi had died. He described the basement of his grandmother's house. He described, in precise detail, the night Conorak synthesymphone had been walked back to apartment 213 by Milwaukee police officers while a body lay in the bedroom, and photographs of previous victims were scattered on the floor. He showed no indication of pleasure in the telling. He showed no remorse. He showed something closer to a flat, exhausted accuracy, a man performing a final act of documentation. The Milwaukee Police Department's handling of the Dahmer case became, almost immediately, a civic crisis. The revelation of the Conorak synthesomphone incident, that police had returned a drugged, bleeding 14-year-old boy to a registered sex offender while his victim's remains were in the next room, produced a level of public outrage that the department was wholly unprepared for. Officers Balcerzak and Gabrish were fired. The third officer, Parubkan, was suspended. Balcerzak and Gabrish contested their terminations. A police union arbitrator eventually ruled that their firings were too severe. They were reinstated with back pay. John Balcerzak later went on to be elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association. The victims' families, many of whom had been told for months or years that there was nothing unusual about their loved one's disappearance, were confronted with the full reality of what had happened and what had not been done. The grief was compounded by fury. The fury was compounded by the recognition that the failures were not isolated errors, but expressions of a systemic indifference that had specific, identifiable targets. Civil rights organizations in Milwaukee organized. Community leaders demanded accountability. The police chief and the mayor faced press conferences that quickly became confrontational. Questions were raised, publicly, formally, persistently, about whether Dahmer's victims would have been ignored the same way if they had been white. The evidence suggests they would not have been. Studies of missing persons cases in Milwaukee from the same period consistently show that investigations involving Black and Latino victims were pursued with fewer resources, less urgency, and shorter active phases than those involving white victims. This was not unique to Milwaukee. It reflected a national pattern that had been documented, challenged, and insufficiently addressed for decades. Dahmer understood this. He said so directly in his confessions. When asked why he believed he had been able to operate for so long without detection, he was unsparing. He targeted men who were poor, who were gay or perceived as gay, who were Black or Latino or Asian, men who, when they disappeared, would not generate the kind of sustained public alarm that would force a serious investigation. He was right, and he had known he was right. The selection of his victims was not random. It reflected a calculated, if pathologically motivated, exploitation of the blind spots of the system around him. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of the Dahmer case, and one that has never been fully absorbed into the mainstream narrative, which tends to focus on Dahmer's psychology, on the horror of what was found in apartment 213, and on the dramatic circumstances of his arrest. The question of why he was never caught sooner, and what that failure reveals about whose lives are considered worth protecting, remains unresolved in the civic memory of Milwaukee and in American criminal justice more broadly. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992. The question before the court was not whether Dahmer had committed the murders. He had confessed to all 17. The question was whether he was legally sane at the time, whether he had the capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. The defense argued that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease, specifically a necrophilic disorder so severe that it constituted a mental illness under Wisconsin law, that the compulsion had overwhelmed his capacity for rational choice. that he should be found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect and committed to a psychiatric institution rather than imprisoned. The prosecution argued the opposite, that Dahmer's crimes were methodical, planned, and sustained over 13 years with extraordinary operational discipline, that he had taken specific steps to avoid detection, drugging victims to prevent resistance, dismembering remains to prevent identification, maintaining a job and probation compliance to preserve his cover, that a man capable of all of this was capable of choosing to stop. The expert witnesses on both sides were distinguished forensic psychiatrists. They disagreed fundamentally about whether Dahmer's paraphilic disorders crossed the legal threshold into mental disease. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. They found Dahmer sane, guilty on 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years. In Ohio, where Stephen Hicks had been killed in 1978, he was subsequently convicted of a 16th murder and sentenced to a 16th life term. During the sentencing phase, the families of Dahmer's victims were given the opportunity to speak. They did. What they said in that courtroom was not theatrical. It was not performative. It was the specific, irreplaceable grief of people who had watched their son, their brother, their father, their child be reduced to evidence, to photographs in a drawer and bones in a drum, and who now stood a few feet from the man who had done it and were given 3 minutes to say whatever they had left to say. One mother described the last phone call she had received from her son. His voice, what he had said. The ordinary things people say when they don't know it's the last time. One father described posting flyers for years, driving through neighborhoods at night with his wife, looking. Konarak Sinthasomphon's family described what it had meant to survive persecution in Laos, to spend a year in a refugee camp, to finally reach safety in America, and then to have that safety revoked by a system that had held their child in its hands and handed him back to the man who killed him. Dahmer addressed the court after the families had spoken. He said he wished he could bring back each victim. He said he knew he couldn't. He said he was sorry. Whether that apology was genuine, whether the man who had so methodically dismembered and consumed his victims was capable of something recognizable as remorse, is a question that forensic clinicians have disagreed about ever since. What is not in dispute is what he said next. He said he wanted the death penalty. He said he did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge denied the request. Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853, the first state in the nation to do so. Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution to serve the remainder of his life. He served less than 3 years. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson, a white man convicted of murdering his wife, and Christopher Scarver, a black man serving a life sentence for murder. The 3 were left unsupervised by correctional staff for approximately 20 minutes. When staff returned, Dahmer and Anderson were both unconscious on the floor, their skulls severely fractured. Dahmer was transported to a local hospital. He was pronounced dead approximately 1 hour later. Jesse Anderson died 2 days after. Christopher Scarver told investigators that Dahmer had taunted him and other inmates, fashioning pieces of prison food into human limbs, using ketchup to simulate blood, displaying them to other prisoners to provoke reactions. Scarver, who had already expressed contempt for Dahmer and Anderson during their shared time in the institution, had obtained a metal bar from the weight room. He used it with decisive, fatal force. Scarver later gave a more expansive account of his motivations to the New York Times in 2015. He described Dahmer as openly provocative toward other inmates, aware of the effect his notoriety had on the people around him and willing to exploit it. He described a man who had not diminished in prison, who had not receded into contrition or invisibility, who remained, in some essential way, the same. Dahmer was 34 years old when he died. He had been incarcerated for approximately 940 days. The reaction to his death was divided along lines that largely mirrored the reaction to his crimes. Some expressed relief, including several of his victims' family members, who said simply that they were glad he was gone. Others expressed concern about the circumstances of his death and what it suggested about the safety and oversight conditions inside the Columbia Correctional Institution. A small number, a very small number, expressed something resembling grief. The Oxford apartments were demolished 15 months after his arrest. The site sat empty for years. Various proposals were made for its redevelopment. A children's park was suggested at one point. Nothing was built. The lot remained vacant for decades. Some of Dahmer's victims' families had wanted the building torn down. Others had wanted a memorial on the site. Neither impulse was fully honored. The city of Milwaukee, like the country as a whole, seemed to prefer not to look directly at what the Dahmer case revealed, not just about the man who had lived in apartment 213, but about the city that had surrounded him. There is a question that runs through every serious analysis of the Dahmer case, through the forensic psychiatry reports, the investigative reviews, the academic literature, the documentaries, the journalism. And it is never fully answered, not because the answer is unknowable, but because the answer is uncomfortable enough that most accounts stop just short of stating it plainly. The question is this: at what point was Jeffrey Dahmer catchable? Not in the abstract sense of whether his crimes were physically traceable, they were at multiple junctures, but in the institutional sense. At what point did the systems around him have sufficient information, sufficient evidence, sufficient legal authority to intervene and choose not to? The answer, when you lay the timeline out with precision, is devastating. In 1978, Dahmer killed Stephen Hicks. He was 18 years old. He was living alone in an unsupervised household following a chaotic parental divorce. No welfare check was conducted. No one in the systems surrounding that family, schools, courts, medical institutions, had flagged the years of behavioral warnings that preceded that murder. The opportunity to intervene before the first killing existed. It was not taken. In 1982, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure. A criminal record was created. Nothing else changed. In 1986, he was arrested again, this time for masturbating in front of children. He was convicted. He was placed on probation. His father's written request for mandatory psychological treatment was ignored. He was released early. In 1988, he molested Somsak Synthesomphone, the 13-year-old older brother of the boy who would later be returned to him by police. He was convicted of second-degree sexual assault. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail and 5 years of probation. He served 10 months. He was released. He was required to register as a sex offender and to check in regularly with a supervision officer. His probation officer later testified that Dahmer had been a model probationer, that he had showed up on time, that he had said the right things, that there had been no indicators of ongoing criminal behavior. During those same probation months, Dahmer killed 4 people. The supervision system designed to monitor a convicted sex offender with documented predatory behavior toward young males did not detect a single one of those murders. Because Dahmer kept his apartment clean for check-in visits, because he held his job, because he wore the right face. In May 1991, police officers stood in apartment 213 with Konarak synthesomphone, drugged, bleeding, 14 years old, and left him there. They did not run a background check on Dahmer. They did not call his probation officer. They did not take the boy to a hospital. They did not listen to the women who had called 911. 4 more people died. Every one of these failures was a choice. Not a conscious choice to enable murder, but a choice shaped by assumptions, by indifference, by the specific weight that different lives carry in different institutional contexts. The choice to not run a background check. The choice to not pursue a missing persons case with full resources. The choice to believe a calm white man over a group of alarmed black women on a street corner at night. These are not aberrations. They are patterns. And the Dahmer case is one of the most extensively documented examples of what those patterns, sustained over time, produce. What Jeffrey Dahmer reveals about the human mind is not, finally, the most important thing the case has to teach. He reveals something, certainly. Forensic psychology has spent 3 decades extracting clinical meaning from his profile, his attachment pathology, his possession compulsions, the trajectory from animal dissection to human dismemberment, the specific mechanics of how a person builds an interior life so detached from ordinary moral reality that 17 murders become sustainable. These are real insights. They have genuine value for the field. But the clinical portrait of Dahmer, the psychology, the diagnosis, the careful documentation of how he became what he became, has consistently served a secondary function in the public imagination. It has provided a framework for containing him, for placing him at a sufficient distance from ordinary human experience that the discomfort of proximity becomes manageable. He was a monster. He was sick. He was broken in ways that most people are not broken. All of that may be true. None of it is the point. The point is that 17 families reported 17 missing people to a city that did not look hard enough. The point is that a registered sex offender on active probation killed 4 people during the period he was being supervised. And no one noticed. The point is that a 14-year-old boy was handed back to his killer by the people whose job it was to protect him, and those people faced no lasting professional consequences. The point is that when Tracy Edwards ran into the street with a handcuff on his wrist, the officers who found him were initially skeptical of his account. A man with a handcuff on his wrist in obvious distress, claiming to have been held captive, and the first instinct was doubt. Think about what that instinct reflects. Think about who it protects. Think about who it fails. The Dahmer case is a mirror. It reflects something back about the society in which it happened, about whose safety is a priority, whose disappearance generates urgency, whose word carries weight in an encounter with law enforcement. Those are not questions that died with Jeffrey Dahmer in a prison bathroom in 1994. They are questions that remain alive in every city in the country, in every department, in every institutional system that decides day by day whose crisis is worth taking seriously. 17 men, 17 names, 17 futures that ended in apartment 213. They deserved better from the city, from the systems, from the people who were supposed to look. They did not get it. And the most honest thing that can be said about the Dahmer case, after all the psychology, after all the forensics, after all the documentation, is that the greatest horror it contains is not what one man did in a locked apartment. It is what a city allowed to happen around him for 13 years, in plain sight.